Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Issues of the Heart podcast. I'm the host, Brother Kobe.
And I'm Rogers. We spent a couple of weeks talking about Daniel chapter 7, and I know it's been a little while since we have been in the book of Daniel, but guess what? Today is the day we're getting back to Daniel. So we're going to start back in chapter 8, and that sequentially follows chapter 7. Now, we talked about two things going back from our very beginning in the discussion of Daniel. We said that there is a first part that deals with history, and then there's a second part that deals with prophecy. So now we're going really into a lot of the different prophetic utterances and things that Daniel saw that are of special significance. And we want to talk about those and be able to separate truth from fiction and to look at plainly the things that Daniel saw as he saw that were especially applicable to Israel. And then when we get further on into the latter portions of the book, we'll see those things that are applicable for the last days. So let's begin with chapter 8. In the backdrop of chapter 8, we see that Daniel is, according to verse 1, that it is in the third year of the reign of King Belshazzar. He has this vision by the river. And what is this vision that he sees? He sees a vision of a ram and a he-goat. You can read this in the first few verses in Daniel chapter 8, roughly like verses 1 through about verse 9 or so. So he sees this ram and this he-goat. And the ram and the he-goat are in conflict with one another. In fact, I'll read in Daniel 8, verse 3, it says, I lifted up mine eyes and saw, and behold, there stood before the river a ram which had two horns. And the two horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the other came up last. Now the higher came up last. And I saw the ram pushing westward and northward and southward, so that no beast might stand before him, neither was there any that could deliver out of his hand. But he did according to his will and became great. And I was considering the ram, and as I was considering, behold, an he-goat, or a rough goat, came from the west on the face of the whole earth, and he touched not the ground, and the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. And he came to the ram that had the two horns, which I had seen standing before the river, and ran into him in the fury of his power. In the following verses, of course, it describes essentially that the ram was toppled by this rough goat, and the rough goat just stamped him down to the ground and took the best of him. He broke the horn that was on the ram, and that later on then this rough goat that has taken over, that he had a notable horn that came out, and that notable horn branched off into four horns and such. When we look at that, we understand the significance of it, because if Daniel was seeing this and God is trying to communicate and to share forth a revelation as to what does the future hold. That was the whole purpose, God trying to show his will to Daniel so that Daniel might be able to be a prophet to his people and also to the nations. So we don't want to lose sight of that when we study prophecy and we study the Bible, that God is not given knowledge and truth just to be stuck in and kept by one person or kept by a party or a group of believers, but ultimately that truth is to go out to the world. Now, there are a lot of different interpretations as to what the ram and the he-goat mean. I've heard some people say that the ram and the he-goat represent Iran and Iraq, and that these are the conflicts between these two entities. And so when we look in the Middle East and we see hostilities there, that people were quick to say, hey, this is what Daniel was talking about. That's that ram and that he-goat. And then other nations are also interspersed as being representative of the ram and the he-goat. And while all those things are fanciful, it's important and imperative that we let the scriptures speak for itself. What does the Bible say? Does the Bible give us any insight as to the identity of these persons? What is the Bible talking about in terms of this conquest that takes place? So we'll look at the first few verses and again, explain them. And then after explaining them, we want to look at what powers these represent. So first off, it says that this ram in verse 4, that he's pushing westward and he's also going northward and southward. No beast is able to stand before it. In Bible prophecy, a beast, especially in the book of Daniel and Revelation, a beast represents a kingdom. We see that in Daniel chapter 7 and verse 17, and also in Daniel chapter 7 and verse 23, that a beast is symbolic of a kingdom. So what is Daniel talking about? He's talking about a kingdom going forth and conquering, military might, prowess, power. No nation is able to stand before it. And then in this ram, it says that he had a notable horn, and then this horn with two horns, like one, the higher came up last. So what this symbolizes then two different nations that are rising up. And how do we know that? When we look a little bit further down in Daniel, we see what this means. Then the second thing that is of note is that the rough goat comes, and the rough goat comes, according to verse 5, that he comes from the west, and he's running with great speed. And when he comes and he smashes against the ram, and he breaks the ram's horn, puts the ram on the ground and subdues and conquers this ram. So even though we may not know what nation this represents, we do understand and know that if, once again, that the beasts symbolize nations, that this is saying that one nation is going to overcome another nation. So in short, the first nation was subduing and conquering all the nations before it. Then another nation rises up that comes and subdues and conquers it. And its nation had a notable horn that was in it. And then after this notable horn, it broke off into 4 horns. And so what does all this represent? So I'm going to go into another piece of it and give the interpretation of it, because in it, before Daniel gives the interpretation, he talks about something mystical that takes place with this notable horn that is there. This one horn that it ends up enveloping into 4 horns, and then out of the 4 there comes up a little horn, and this little horn, according to verse 9, that it waxes great even to the host of heaven, and it begins to do great things against the host of God, against the government of God, against the sanctuary of God. And according to verse 11, it says that he magnifies himself even to the prince of the host. So again, this out of this nation is going to rise up this little horn power that's going to do great things against the government of God. And again, people are quick to jump in and to say, oh, that means this country, that means this kingdom here. But it's imperative that we allow the scriptures to interpret itself. Let the scriptures speak and give us the understanding and the interpretation of what it is. So when we go to the following verses, down to Daniel chapter 8, and if you notice in verse 20 and 21, we don't have any question as to what it represents, okay? Because the Bible is explicit in what it means and what it doesn't mean. So look in verse 20 and 21. It says, the ram which thou sawest having 2 horns are the kings of Media and Persia. So we can remove any type of speculation, innuendo, any thoughts as to Iraq, Iran, other nations, the United States, Russia. It specifically says that the ram that thou sawest having 2 horns was the kingdom of Media and Persia. So again, that ties in a divided kingdom, the Medes and the Persians. Then the second component in verse 21, that the rough goat is the king of Greece, and the goat, the great horn that is between his eyes, is that first king. This follows again what we've read previously. History lets us know that after Medo-Persia ruled the world, that the next entity that came along was Greece. So Greece is the power, this rough goat that comes along. This notable horn is none other than Alexander the Great. So we have clear explanation now. Who the ram is, who the rough goat is, what the ram does, what the rough goat does, and how that notable horn is broken. And as I mentioned before, that notable horn, it breaks, and then there are 4 horns that come out, and then there's a little horn that rises up. Now, quickly, the other piece that we also consider, that as we look at Daniel 7, 8, 9, and so forth, in Daniel 2, that gave us the framework of the outline of prophecy. In Daniel 2, we saw the first kingdom. Remember, we looked at those kingdoms. We had the metallic image. The head was of gold. The chest was of silver. The belly and the brass were of iron, and the legs were of iron, and then the toes were of iron and clay. That image was smitten upon the feet from a stone that was caught out of the mountain without hands. We saw that image, the head of gold, was Babylon. And we then identified in the following chapters, in chapter 5, that Medo-Persia took over after Babylon. Now we're seeing again in chapter 8 that Greece comes along. So we have like 4 world empires that are identified in scripture. Now, there were certainly other world empires that ruled, but these 4 empires that come along in scripture in the image of Daniel 2 as they relate to their interaction with God's people: Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and then Rome. So when we follow that sequence, now we see in chapter 8, Medo-Persia, and we see Greece. And then we see something that's interesting that I'm going to let you talk about. And that is this notable horn that breaks, and then this little horn power that ultimately comes up after the four. And again, those four denote again those four generals that took over Alexander's kingdom after he died and would ultimately divide it and carve out different portions, Cassander, Lysimachus, Seleucus, and Ptolemy. Now, this horn that stretches up to heaven, who is it? What is it? What does he do? So let you talk about that.
Well, one of the things, looking at this is there's connecting links. And one of the problems with interpretation that people have is that they look at these different visions, especially of Daniel, and they separate them. And so Daniel 2 is talking about one thing, Daniel chapter 7, something different, Daniel chapter 8, a whole different vision. And when we begin to see the connecting links, that these are all the same vision, but using different outward symbols and giving more detail, then it provides clarity to us. And so I don't know if you've ever told a story to somebody and it's almost as though they didn't get it. So you told the story another way and they didn't get that. So you told the story again using different parables or different, from another angle, trying to get them to understand. That's what God is doing. He's trying to show us the same history from a different perspective. You get, the picture of Daniel 2 from a societal lens, Daniel chapter 7 from a judicial lens. When you look at Daniel chapter 8, it's from a more ecclesiastical lens. As a matter of fact, looking at it, this is Day of Atonement language. When you compare this to Leviticus 16, Leviticus 23, and understand the Day of Atonement, the language of that is crouched in this very prophecy. And what's interesting that's here is that when you look at, the ram and the he-goat, God spends very little time. He tells you who it is. And like you said, we don't have to guess about it, but he doesn't spend a lot of time explaining and going into the details. But it's interesting that when we look into Daniel chapter 2s, to Daniel chapter 7s, to Daniel chapter 8s, and so forth, he seems to spend a lot of time on that fourth kingdom, that fourth power. And here is the little horn. And so he goes into great detail. He spends like double and triple the amount of time explaining and going into detail about this fourth power. And so we see that it's important. And another thing that we see, God is not, he's bold to say, hey, this is Babylon, this is Medo-Persia, this is Greece. When it comes down to that fourth kingdom, he's more careful in the language. He doesn't just come out and say it's this, but it gives you clues and hints as to this power. Why? Because this power lasts all the way down to the end. See, before Medo-Persia is going to be conquered, Greece conquered, Babylon conquered, Medo-Persia conquered, Greece conquered. So they had their time in history. When this fourth kingdom, it actually lasts down to the end. And so the Bible spends a lot of time on this fourth power. And another connection that we see between Daniel chapter 7, Daniel chapter 8, to know that they're all connected. Because I know it's been a long time since we've been there, but if you remember, when we talked about Daniel 7, yes, we talked about the powers that were there, and we focused on that fourth beast, that fourth kingdom that was there. But also there was this judgment scene that took place in Daniel chapter 7. And so Daniel chapter 8 will kind of give some more detail, because one of the things that we talked about, it says, all right, it kind of gives us somewhat of an understanding about when this judgment scene will take place, but it's still kind of in the air, around about, where God will get more specific as to the time of that judgment. However, getting down to this little horn power, when you look at it, it gives you certain clues and certain things that's going to be crouched within it. When we look at these powers, you see the expanse of the greatness. When it's talking about Medo-Persia, it says in verse 4 that it became great, right? The last part of that, it said he became great. When it came to the Greek kingdom, that he-goat, it said that in verse 8, it said, therefore the he-goat waxed very great. And then in verse 9, referring to this little horn power, it said it waxed exceeding great. And so when you look at these kingdoms, you see this expanse of power going from great to very great to exceeding great. And so one kingdom would exceed another in greatness and power and so forth, and territory that they would occupy. And so when we look at this, we can understand that, hey, these nations are brought into play as they have some interaction with God's people. That's why when you see in verse 9, he says, and out of one of them came forth a little horn, which waxed exceeding great towards the south, towards the east, and towards the pleasant land. And so when we look at this kingdom, it will have some type of connection, some type of interaction with God's people who are found in the pleasant land, or another term that he uses is the glorious land. That's Palestine. That's where God's people were, that Canaan land that God has given to them as an inheritance. So we know that this power would have some type of connection, some type of interaction with God's people. Now, one of the things that we can pinpoint who this king, because God doesn't come out and say like he did with the ram and he-goat, say, oh, this is me, the person, and this is Greece. But he gives us clues. One of the greatest clues that he gives us is that this, in verse 11, he says, yea, and he waxed, and he magnified himself even to the prince of the host, right? And then when you drop down in verse 25, when he's further explaining and expounding the vision, he says, and through his policy also he shall cause craft to prosper in his hand, and he shall magnify himself in his heart, and by peace shall destroy many. He also shall stand up against the prince of princes, that he shall be destroyed without hand. And you know what's interesting about that? Well, let me deal with this first. So that's clearly the prince of the host, the prince of the princes. There's clearly a designation or a term designated towards Christ. So we know that this power will be the power that was ruling and in power during the time of Christ. And so all we had to do is go to the New Testament and look at, well, what kingdom was ruling the nations, ruling the world at the time of Christ. As a matter of fact, Daniel chapter 11 goes into a little bit more detail. Daniel 11. Verse 20, he says this, then shall stand up in his estate a raiser of taxes in the glory of the kingdom, but within few days he shall be destroyed, neither in anger nor in battle. So he's talking about this raiser of taxes. When you go to the New Testament in the book of Luke, what brought Jesus to Bethlehem? Well, yes, the prophecy said that he would be there. Well, remember, the Bible said there was Caesar Augustus, and how he taxed the whole world, and because of this taxation, they had to come back to their native land. And that's what brought Jesus to Bethlehem. And so when we look at this, we know that that was the kingdom of Rome. So without God saying the name, he gives us enough clues to understand that this is the power being referred to. However, there's something key and important here. Even though he speaks in the sense of Daniel chapter 7 shows a beast with a little horn that raises up. So you have, if you will, a kingdom within a kingdom, right? Here, he's using a little horn to refer to a dual power, right? So it's not just one entity, it's two entities. Now, there's a terminology that God uses to, how could you go to somebody and say, hey, this little horn actually represents two separate powers, two separate kingdoms? How would you explain that biblically? Well, the Bible uses a terminology that he gives to us in verse 13. Verse 13, he says, then I heard one saint speak. Oh, we're back in Daniel chapter 8, by the way. Then I heard one saint speaking, and another saint said unto that certain saint which spake, how long shall be the vision concerning the daily and the transgression of desolation, to give both the sanctuary and the host to be trodden underfoot. When we look at this, the daily, that the word sacrifice is in italicized, is added. They believe that daily referred to something different, but this is the daily desolation and also the transgression of desolation. It's describing two separate powers, and that both these powers, why they're seen as one entity, is because they commence to do the same work. Both of them persecute God's people. Both of them have this work that it would try to trot underfoot the sanctuary and the host. And so because it does the same exact work, God has linked them both. There is a connection between the two that we might explain at a later date. But that's the term, that's how what God uses to explain, or the code language that he uses to explain the dual aspects of this little horn. And so when we look at this, what's interesting about this is this vision is so important that Jesus himself shows up, because he said one saint was speaking to another saint. When you look that term up, one saint speaking to another, that certain saint, when you look it up, it's the Palamon. I don't know if I'm saying it right. But it's the number of sequence, or the wonderful number, a reference to Christ. So Christ shows up in this very vision and gives some directions. And what's interesting about this, when you look later in Daniel, you see kind of almost a similar thing going on, where an angel comes down, swears by him that lives forever and ever, how long shall be the vision, and he goes and he tells until a certain time. However, I want to look at something before I give it back to you. When you look at this, Daniel was told something in this vision. Verse 26. He says, in the vision of the evenings and the morning, which was told is true, wherefore set up the vision, for it shall be for many days. So there was a certain portion that he said was set up or closed. Now, some people take this to mean, well, you can't understand the books of Daniel because God said, set it up, seal it, and so forth. Well, clearly, it can be understood because the angel explained who the powers were. He explained the he-goat, he explained the ram, he explained the little horn power, and he went into great detail. But there was one portion of the vision that went unexplained. And he told you it was the vision of the evenings and mornings, meaning that 2,300 days, where he says, and he said unto me, unto 2,300 days, or evenings and mornings, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. That portion remained unexplained in Daniel chapter 8. And so he said, close it up. And we understand an important principle from this, is that the fulfillment of it was going to come way later. So there was no need to explain it to Daniel, because you're not going to be around to understand or benefit from it. But when the time comes for this to be fulfilled, God will reveal it to those people then living. Not just the last text, Daniel chapter 12. Daniel chapter 12. And it says in verse 4, but thou, O Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book, even to the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall be increased. So Daniel there was told to shut up the words and seal the book. And so again, not the whole book of Daniel, because clearly certain things were being explained, but that portion that was left unexplained, well, guess what? We're at the time of the end. We should be able to understand and get into what was that portion that was closed up and that was sealed.
It's important for us to understand what are the sequence of things. What was Daniel shown that's relevant for us as we believe we're living in the last days of Earth's history. Daniel sees these things and he writes them down. And again, to emphasize, they're not given for instruction for Daniel to shroud in mystery, but it's not sealed. Those portions that he did not understand, that was that piece that related then to the 2,300 days, this whole aspect. Now, it's important to note how and why is the subject of the 2,300 days even introduced. In fact, when we looked at it so far, we saw the ram and the he-goat coming forth to battle. And then we saw the interjection then of this notable horn, this little horn power that waxes great even against the host of heaven. You talked about how the earthly kingdoms hitherto had created an expansion of territory horizontally, going to the east, to the north, to the south, to the west. This little horn power does something different. In addition to doing that in the conquest of nations, it instigates war against the government of God. So it not only takes a horizontal approach, but it also takes a vertical approach, a vertical attack toward the government and the kingdom of God, because this nation, it speaks great words against the Most High. This nation seeks to wear out the saints of the Most High. This nation seeks to change times and laws. This nation persecutes not only the saints, but it magnifies itself against the prince of the host. The sanctuary, it casts down underfoot. So the ram, the rough goat, they're casting down other nations. But this nation, this particular power, is trying to do this to the truth, trying to do this to God's truth, trying to do this to Christ, to bring him down, to cast him down to the earth. And that's important because, again, that introduces the spiritual dynamic behind it. The whole point of giving us these prophecies is not just to give us enlightenment in respect of the nations that would rise up one after the other. This is not some knowledge that is given just to make us intellectual, but the purpose of it is to be able to see the spiritual contest that is there. Ezekiel said that the movement of heaven was like a wheel within a wheel, and that foreshadowed how God oversees the events and the affairs of earth, because hitherto we've seen a similar language or message that God communicated to Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar, when he finally got converted, he said that there is a God that rules in heaven and that he rules according to his will. And all the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing in his sight. And he gives the kingdom to whoever he wants. It is interesting to note that that is almost parallel to what Daniel had told him in chapter 2. In Daniel 2, Daniel said that God gives a kingdom to whoever he wants. Nebuchadnezzar wasn't buying that. He didn't buy it in chapter 2. He wasn't how to really grasp it in chapter 3. And then in chapter 4, once he has this conversion experience, where now his heart is broken, his heart is humbled, that he now begins to see things through a heart that has been softened and been renewed by divine grace. And we talked about before some of the challenges that he had, that he had come to God, but then the paganism, it rested in his heart. And now in chapter 4, he has this experience now, and he truly understands that God is the sovereign of all things. That's an important lesson for us to be able to grasp. This nation here has not come to grips with that. And so it fights against God, against the prerogatives of God. And so we're going to identify again who that is, who this nation is. But to set it up, the sequence of events is in verse 11. So in Daniel 8 and verse 11, as we read before, that he magnifies himself to the prince of the host. And by him, the daily is taken away, and the place of the sanctuary is cast down, and the host is given to him against the transgression, and it cast down the truth to the ground, and it practiced and prospered. And so this is what he's doing. It's like he is reveling in his power. He's reveling in his might. There's nobody that can stop him, so it seems. And then verse 13 is that one saint speaks to another saint, and the question is, how long shall be the vision concerning the daily and the sanctuary, to give both the daily and the transgression of desolation, to give both the sanctuary and the host to be trodden underfoot? Paraphrasing it, the saint was saying, how long is this power going to do all this against the government of God? How long is this power going to oppress and to stamp down God's truth? How long is this power going to do these things against God's people? How long is this power going to rebel against Christ and his government? And that's almost like the language that the souls under the altar in Revelation are seen crying out. How long, O Lord, before thou shalt avenge our blood? And then the answer comes back in verse 14, that he said unto me, unto 2,300 days then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. So what is he saying? This is the answer. Again, the question was, how long is this power going to do this? And now the answer is that into 2,300 days, then the sanctuary is going to be cleansed. Well, what on earth does that mean, that the sanctuary is going to be cleansed? How is this going to address this particular problem? So our next time together, we're going to look into Daniel 8:14, and we're going to understand how that vital piece is going to explain and to be, it's the answer to the riddle that is put forth. How is this going to take place? What is this cleansing of the sanctuary? How is this going to bring order out of disorder? How is it going to answer to the charge that this little horn power has been trampling overfoot the sanctuary, God's truth, God's people? What's going to happen in the cleansing of the sanctuary? So we're going to look at that when we come back together again. So before we stop, I don't know if you had any last comments or anything you want to add in.
Just briefly, again, there's this connection between Daniel chapter 7 and Daniel chapter 8. There's this judgment scene in Daniel chapter 7. And this judgment scene is being answered to or spoken to again in the time frame that you brought up, to 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. But I want to bring this point out. Daniel chapter 7 said, he shall think to change times and laws. Daniel chapter 8, he uses a different phrase, but it's referring to the same thing. He shall cast down the truth to the ground, as you read. And so in particular, it's the truth in reference to the law of God that they cast down to the ground. And it's that Sabbath truth that this power has cast down to the ground. And that's why the vast majority of Christianity, and this is not knocking people who may worship differently and so forth, but God's Decalogue says the 7th-day Sabbath. The majority of Christendom says, no, the first day of the week, Sunday. And so that's just another proof in how this power was successful in thinking to change times and laws and casting down this truth to the ground, that portion of the law of God has been trampled underfoot even unto this day.
I like how Daniel puts it, that he thinks to change times and laws. And really what that's suggesting is that, he's thinking he's doing it, but, you can't change what God has written. You can't, you can't, quote, break the law. God is in charge. He's sovereign. So it's like, we might say just in our talk, like, hey, he think he's really doing something, and you like really trying your hardest and best, but you're not doing anything. And that's what this little horn power is doing. He's thinking he's doing something. And he feels that he's been successful because by and large, he is swept away the vast majority of Christendom in trying to institute things in which God has not said to institute. And then the thing which God has said to observe and to be mindful of, he swept that away. And so in this instance, you talked about the replacement then of the Sabbath and how God has given in his Decalogue. And this power thinks, hey, I've changed things and I'll show you the proof, because I have most people honoring and doing what I've said do. And of course, in ignorance, that this is done by people and so forth. And so we certainly understand that, but this is his claim that he's making. And now there's that pushback that God is saying this through the saints. When is this going to be set in order? What's going to happen to this particular power? Is it just going to go roughshod? But no, into 2,300 days, then the sanctuary is going to be cleansed. So next time we're going to look at what that cleansing of the sanctuary means and what the impact is for this little horn power, what the impact is also for us, because again, it's beyond the power, but it really is personal. It's about us, you and I individually. And so until next time, I want to remind you to keep your heart with all diligence, because out of it are the issues of life.